There are certain ledger entries in the regional archives of the southern Urals that seem to defy the standard rigidity of Soviet record-keeping. Tucked between routine logbooks and mineral surveys lies the account of the 601S supply locomotive, a ghost in the machinery of the 1939 Winter Offensive. It is a narrative reconstructed from the few artifacts recovered decades later. A story of iron, ice, and a geographical silence that was never supposed to exist. The morning of December 12, 1939, began with a sky the color of bruised flint, heavy with the promise of a localized storm. At the railhead in Magnitogorsk, the 601S hissed rhythmically, its boiler breathing out thick plumes of white steam that vanished into the freezing air. Engineer Pyotr Volkov checked his watch against the station master's clock, noting the precise moment of departure for the 60-mile transit. To the men on the platform, it was a routine delivery of coal and grain, a mechanical heartbeat pulsing through the snowy veins of the mountain pass. As the locomotive pulled away from the industrial smoke of the city, the tracks stretched out like a narrowing ladder toward the jagged horizon. The rhythmic clacking of the wheels against the iron rails provided a steady, comforting pulse against the vast silence of the rising taiga. Inside the cab, the heat from the firebox cast a deep orange glow over the brass gauges and the weathered faces of the three-man crew. They were moving into the high country, where the trees grew thick and the light began to fail long before the sun actually set. By the second hour, the light had transitioned from a pale gray to a translucent, ghostly blue that seemed to emanate from the snow itself. The forests of the Ural Range pressed in close to the embankment, their branches heavy with a frost so thick it looked like white stone. Volkov noticed the first sign of the coming whiteout, a fine, crystalline powder that began to dance across the glass of the windshield. The world outside the cab was losing its edges, dissolving into a monochromatic haze where the earth and sky were indistinguishable. The locomotive began its steep ascent toward the pass, the engine laboring with a deep metallic groan that echoed off the unseen granite walls. Fedor, the fireman, shoveled coal with a mechanical precision, his movements silhouetted against the roaring hunger of the furnace. The heat in the small cabin was stifling, clashing with the bitter drafts that whistled through the gaps in the iron plating. They were isolated now, a small island of fire and steel moving through a landscape that felt increasingly indifferent to their progress. When they reached the 40-mile marker, the atmospheric pressure seemed to shift, bringing with it a silence so heavy it muffled the roar of the engine. The wind died down abruptly, leaving the snow to fall in massive vertical flakes that blanketed the world in a suffocating velvet. Volkov reached for the radio handset to check in with the northern checkpoint, but all he encountered was a wall of static. It wasn't the erratic crackle of a storm, but a flat, humming drone that felt like the sound of a deep, underground vacuum.
Transcription here.
In the dim light of the cabin, the primary compass mounted near the throttle began to behave erratically, its needle shivering before spinning in a slow, lazy circle. Volkov tapped the glass, thinking the cold had seized the mechanism, but the needle refused to find its north. He looked out at the tracks ahead, but the twin lines of iron were being swallowed by the accumulating drift faster than the plow could clear them. For the first time in his 20-year career, the engineer felt a hollow sensation in his chest, a realization that the map in his mind no longer matched the world outside. He pulled a small, leather-bound notebook from his coat pocket and scribbled a brief entry by the light of a flickering oil lantern. He noted the time, the coordinate of the last visible marker, and the strange behavior of the magnetic instruments. His handwriting was steady, reflecting the professional detachment required of a Soviet railman, yet the words described a growing impossibility. He wrote of a horizon that seemed to be tilting, and a forest that appeared to be thickening in ways the survey teams had never reported. They came upon a set of points in the track that shouldn't have been there, a rusted switch leading off into a narrow, shadowed valley to the east. According to the official 1937 rail charts, this was a straight run with no diversions for another 15 miles. The iron of the switch looked ancient, pitted with age and half buried in the ice, yet the tracks were clear of debris. Volkov throttled back, the screech of the brakes biting into the silence of the woods as he peered into the gloom. Fedor climbed down from the cab, his boots sinking deep into the powdery snow as he approached the manual lever for the switch. He signaled back with his lantern, the yellow light swinging in wide, frantic arcs through the falling flakes. The tracks ahead on the main line appeared to be blocked by a massive fresh rockfall that had been hidden by the curve and the fog. The only way forward, or so it seemed, in the confusion of the whiteout, was to take the unknown diversion and hope it looped back to the main line. As the 601S slowly lurched onto the unauthorized spur, the sound of the wheels changed from a sharp ring to a dull, grinding thud. The forest here was different. The trees were stunted and twisted, their trunks scarred by old lightning strikes or some forgotten blight. The locomotive moved at a walking pace now, its headlamp cutting a weak yellow tunnel through a mist that felt thick enough to touch. There were no more markers, no telegraph poles, and no signs that any human had passed through this corridor in a generation. The grade of the track began to level out, leading them into a perfectly circular clearing surrounded by high, sheer cliffs of magnetite-rich ore. The magnetic pull was now so intense that the pocket watches of the crew began to skip seconds, their gears straining against an invisible force. Volkov looked out the side window and saw a series of derelict logging cabins, their roofs caved in by decades of neglected winters. This was the dead end, a decommissioned spur from the early industrial era that had been erased from the maps for a reason. The engine hissed as they came to a final, shuddering halt where the track simply ended against a wall of unyielding stone. Behind them, the path they had taken was already being erased by the relentless, silent accumulation of the Ural snow. The coal reserves were still high, and the boiler was strong, but the world beyond the clearing had vanished into a white void. Volkov sat back in his seat, watching the needle of the compass spin rhythmically, keeping time with a heart that was starting to slow. The silence that followed the engine's cutoff was more absolute than anything Volkov had experienced in his years on the line. Inside the cab, the only sound was the metallic ticking of the cooling iron, a rhythmic contracting that sounded like a slow, dying pulse. Outside, the blizzard had reached a peak of eerie stillness, with the massive flakes falling so densely they seemed to absorb the very light from the locomotive's headlamp. Fedor and the third man, a young brakeman named Alexei, stood motionless, staring at the stone wall that had brought their journey to a definitive end. Volkov opened the heavy iron door of the cab, and the cold that rushed in was not merely a temperature, but a physical weight that seemed to suck the breath from his lungs. He stepped out onto the iron plate, his lantern casting long, distorted shadows against the jagged magnetite cliffs that boxed them in. The rock face was dark, shimmering with a metallic luster that explained the madness of their instruments. This was a natural amphitheater of iron, a geological fluke that had been drawing in the unwary long before the first rail was ever spiked. The brakeman, Alexei, pointed toward the cluster of collapsed cabins at the edge of the clearing, his hand shaking slightly from the sudden drop in pressure. In the dim glow, they could see the remains of a small wooden platform, likely used for loading timber during the brief mining boom of the 1920s. The wood was silvered and splintered by decades of rot, yet it stood as a haunting reminder that they were not the first to find themselves in this cul-de-sac. There were no tracks leading out other than the one they had arrived on, which was now buried under 2 feet of fresh, unblemished snow. Returning to the warmth of the cab, Volkov began to calculate their remaining resources with the grim pragmatism of a man who knew the limits of survival. They had enough coal to keep the boiler at a simmer for 48 hours, and their rations could be stretched to a week if they were careful. However, the radio remained a dead weight of humming copper, and the absolute isolation of the mountain pass meant that no rescue party would even begin to look for them until the storm broke. The map spread across the small wooden desk felt like a cruel joke, its neat lines representing a world that no longer applied to their coordinates. As the first night in the anomaly took hold, the temperature plummeted to a level that turned the moisture of their breath into falling ice crystals within the cabin. They took turns feeding the firebox, the orange light flickering across the walls like the heartbeat of a trapped animal. Fedor found an old logbook in a metal locker beneath the seat. Not theirs, but one left behind by a previous crew from a forgotten era. The pages were brittle and stained with damp, the ink fading into illegible ghosts of numbers and names that had long since been struck from the state records. By the early hours of the morning, a strange phenomenon began to manifest on the exterior of the locomotive's boiler. Faint, crawling lines of static electricity, St. Elmo's fire, danced along the handrails and the rim of the smokestack, glowing with a pale, sickly green light. It was a result of the intense magnetic field interacting with the dry, crystalline air of the blizzard, but to the men inside, it looked like a shroud. The hum in the air grew louder, a low-frequency vibration that could be felt in the teeth and the marrow of the bone. Alexei, the youngest among them, began to experience the first signs of the magnetic sickness that often plagued those trapped in high-ore environments. He spoke of hearing a distant, rhythmic ringing, like a bell being struck deep beneath the earth, though the mountains around them remained stony and silent. Volkov watched him closely, noting the dilated pupils and the way the boy's hands hovered over the dead radio dials as if waiting for a signal that would never come. They were losing their grip on the passage of time, as the watches had all stopped at the same hour, 3:14 a.m.
Stop transcription here.
To address the increasing inactivity, Volkov directed a survey of the surrounding region. They linked themselves with a long rope from the support vessel. Moving through the snowdrifts towards the closest dwelling, the snow reached their waists and tried to drag them down. The building was mostly an unfinished frame of logs, but inside they discovered a small metal stove and a pile of wood that was surprisingly dry. On the ground were several old tools and a single substantial brass key. It had no markings but felt unusually warm. Looking back at the 601S from the cabin door, the locomotive looked like a stranded whale, its black iron hull partially swallowed by the rising tide of white. The steam rising from its safety valves was the only sign of life in the entire valley, a thin tether to the world of the living. Volkov realized then that the rockfall they had seen on the main line might not have been a rockfall at all, but an atmospheric trick of the light, a mirage meant to funnel them into this iron trap. The realization was quiet and cold, settling in his stomach like a stone. The second night brought with it a shift in the wind, a high-pitched whistling that sounded like a human voice calling out from the peaks. They huddled together near the firebox, the heat now a desperate necessity as the frost began to creep across the inner walls of the cab. Fedor, usually the most stoic of the group, began to hum a low, mournful tune from his village, a sound that filled the cramped space with a sense of finality. They were waiting for a morning that felt like it might never arrive, trapped in a loop of time governed by the spinning, restless needles of their compasses. When the sun finally rose on the second day, it appeared not as a bright disk, but as a dull copper glow behind a veil of frozen fog. The landscape had been completely reshaped by the wind. The tracks they had arrived on were now obscured by drifts 10 feet high, creating a wall of ice that blocked their exit. Volkov climbed to the roof of the tender, shielding his eyes against the glare, and saw something that froze his blood. Far up on the ridge of the magnetite cliff, there were silhouettes, not of people, but of old, abandoned rail cars perched precariously on the edge as if they had been placed there by a giant hand. These were the lost cars of the 1928 survey, derelicts that had vanished a decade prior, and were now visible only because the wind had stripped the ridge bare. They sat like tombstones overlooking the clearing, their wooden frames skeletal and bleached white by the sun. It was proof that the 601S was merely the latest addition to a collection of iron that the mountain had been gathering for years. The realization that they were part of a repeating pattern, a cycle of human error and natural magnetism, began to erode the last of their professional resolve. Volkov returned to the cabin and opened his journal, his hands now stiff and blue despite the heat of the fire. He wrote not for the archives now, but for whoever might find the iron hull of the 601S in the decades to come. He described the ridge of ghost cars, and the ringing in the ears that never stopped, a sound he now recognized as the vibration of the mountain itself. He left the brass key on the desk next to the notebook, a small, unexplained fragment of a mystery that was rapidly closing over their heads. The final day began with a silence so absolute it felt as though the world had been emptied of sound entirely. The fire in the 601S had finally surrendered, leaving the cabin to the mercy of the mountain air, which now carried the sharp metallic scent of ozone. Volkov watched the last of the embers die out, their orange glow fading into a dull gray ash that mirrored the sky. There was no more coal to shovel, no more pressure to monitor. The locomotive had become nothing more than a cold iron tomb anchored to a dead-end track. Alexei was the first to leave the cab, drawn out by a sudden rhythmic pulsing in the air that seemed to vibrate the very metal beneath their feet. He didn't run or shout, but walked with the slow, deliberate gait of someone following a call only he could hear. Fedor and Volkov watched from the frosted window as the young man disappeared into the thick white veil of the forest, his footprints filling with snow almost as soon as his boots left the ground. They did not call after him, for they knew that in this place, the distance between two people could become an unbridgeable canyon in a matter of seconds. Stop transcription here. By noon, the magnetic interference had reached a terrifying crescendo, causing the very air to shimmer with iridescent waves of light that distorted the landscape. The magnetite cliffs seemed to pulse and breathe, their dark surfaces reflecting a sky that had turned a deep, unnatural violet. Volkov reached for his journal one last time, but his fingers were too frozen to grip the pencil, the wood snapping under the slight pressure of his hand. He left the book open on the throttle, the pages fluttering in the draft like the wings of a trapped bird. Fedor sat on the floor of the tender, his back against the cold iron of the water tank, staring out at the ridge where the ghost cars sat. He claimed he could see movement among the derelict wrecks, figures in old-fashioned rail uniforms moving with a stiff, mechanical precision through the drifts. Whether it was a hallucination brought on by the thin air or a trick of the shifting magnetic light, it no longer seemed to matter. They were no longer engineers or firemen. They were merely observers of a phenomenon that existed outside the boundaries of Soviet science. As the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks for the final time, the 601S was struck by a final, massive surge of static energy that lit the entire clearing in a blinding flash of white. For a brief moment, the mountain pass was revealed in its entirety, showing a network of hidden circular tracks that formed a complex labyrinthine pattern across the valley floor. It was a giant geological machine, fueled by the iron in the earth and the storms in the sky, and they were the latest spark in its engine. Then the light vanished, leaving the world in a darkness so thick it felt like being buried alive. In the decades that followed, the story of the 601S passed from official record into the realm of whispered history among the rail workers of the Urals. Search parties sent out in the spring of 1940 found nothing. No tracks, no locomotive, and no sign of the 3 men who had steamed into the pass. It was as if the mountain had folded in on itself, tucking the secret of the Iron Mountain anomaly away in a pocket of time that the maps could never reach. Only the discovery of a rusted brass key in a geological survey decades later hinted that the story was more than a ghost tale. The locomotive remains there still, a silent monument of iron and ice hidden within a fold of the mountains that only opens when the wind and the magnets align. It sits at the end of a track that leads nowhere, its boiler cold and its crew long since part of the drifting snow. In the quietest hours of a Ural winter, some say you can still hear the rhythmic ticking of cooling metal, a sound that persists long after the fire has gone out. It is a reminder that the Earth still holds places where the laws of man and physics are merely suggestions, and where a wrong turn can lead to a destination that was never meant to be found. The regional authorities eventually designated the Iron Mountain Pass a restricted zone, officially citing unstable geological conditions and hazardous weather patterns. To this day, hikers and surveyors are warned to avoid the area near the 42-mile marker, where the compass needles are known to spin, and the silence feels a little too heavy. Some secrets are not meant to be uncovered, and some trails are better left lost to the whiteout.